Welcome to a dialogue on accountability in the digital age. A dialogue with representatives of a global, multi-stakeholder community.
And I'm your host, Frits Bussemaker, and today I'm delighted and privileged to have a conversation with David Jensen from the UNEP. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Fritz. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Now, David, you've been with the UN since around 2000, I believe, so well over 20 years, and you are the coordinator of the UNEP, so that's the UN Environmental Program for Digital Transition Program, co-champion of the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability, CODES. That's going to be the main topic, what your work at the UNEP. You are from Vancouver Island, because you went to the University of Victoria. Now, before we start on your UN work, I have to ask you this. I've been to Vancouver Island, I've been to Victoria. It's an awesome, beautiful place in the middle of nature. Has that somehow been influencing you on what you're doing right now?
Of course, without question, the beauty of Vancouver Island is hard to really describe. It's an amazing place, and it absolutely drove my interest in environmental protection, conservation, and all of my international work. So absolutely, that's kind of part of my origin story. I also grew up on a farm, and I was involved in nature right from the outset. So absolutely, it's part and parcel of who I am and why I'm working for the UN Environment Program.
Okay, now a brief introduction, how you moved from, you could say, studying biology in Vancouver to running a program on digital transformation. How did that happen?
Basically, I was working for the UN Environment Program, looking at the environmental damages caused by conflicts and caused by disasters. Go in with various teams and collect samples and sort of do the analysis of the risks. What were the risks to human health following a conflict or a disaster from environmental damage? And the more we did the work, the more I got interested in how do we start to use digital technologies to do that work more efficiently and in a more automated way. And it was actually in Colombia. We were flying over Colombia looking at illegal gold mining, and we were in a military helicopter flying over the FARC and the ELN territories. And I was thinking to myself, there's got to be a better way to doing this than being, over the militia territories in a military helicopter in plain sight. And I got interested then in satellite imagery and AI, and it kind of started to snowball. And one thing led to another, and we eventually proposed that digital transformation become one of UNEP's main priority areas. And there were two reasons for that. There was the question of application. How do we use these technologies to be more efficient in what we do? But then there was the bigger question of governance. It was very clear that this governance question was becoming very important, as was the sustainability question. Are these technologies sustainable? Do they have an environmental footprint that we have to look at? So that was the story, and there was a natural transition, basically, from sort of looking at the environmental dimensions of peace and conflict to looking at the environmental dimensions of digital transformation.
Okay, interesting. You mentioned governance, because that's one of the key, I'll say trigger words when you talk about accountability. What we like to talk about accountability is the governance of technology. But why was that an issue for the system you were looking at, your work?
I could see that there was a rising amount of power in a very limited number of digital companies, and using that power, I would say, in monopolistic ways in their relationship with the United Nations, in particular on the question of data governance, data ownership, and IP rights. And I was not pleased with the way that relationship was moving. And it was just very clear to me that if we were going to start to use these tools and technologies for good, that relationship had to be solved and that governance question had to be addressed. And so that was really it. And there's a whole series of aspects of that governance question we can unpack. But ultimately, it was really I could see this growing imbalance of power between the tech world, the UN, and the member states, and that set alarm bells ringing.
Okay, fully understand your thought process here. Now, where do you feel we are today? Because you're not the only one who's recognizing that threat or that situation, as it were. Let's put it more neutral. If that's you could say, the observation, what can you do to resolve that? What can you do to bring it where it should be bringing? So who's going to be involved and how to have that discussion?
Yeah, I think there has been some good progress, at least in brokering dialogues around this. And I think the Secretary General has done a great job in raising this up the political agenda. So, he established this high-level panel on digital cooperation, the digital cooperation roadmap. And I think those really started to bring sort of international attention to this question. The one thing that I would say, I think the first step in that accountability pathway is transparency, right? Who's doing what? Where are the major risks? Where are the major opportunities? And how can we be just more transparent about that distribution of power? So I think transparency is the first thing we need to start with. And that sort of begins with disclosure, right? Disclosing, in my world, it's about transparency of environmental impact and environmental opportunity. So first and foremost, disclosing the supply chain impacts of various companies, disclosing their climate footprint, disclosing their use of natural resources in a very open and transparent way. I think that's number one, and that disclosure leads to transparency, and hopefully then we can move from transparency to accountability.
Okay. Again, yeah, thank you for sharing that discussion. Now, what platform in your mind should we then use to have that discussion, and how can we enforce the discussion? Because having the discussion is great, acknowledging it, but then would that be a UN entity who could drive that? Because you're talking about something which we need to fix on a global level.
Sure. I don't think there's any single platform. I think it's, in a sense, there's multiple different stakeholders that can do this kind of convening. I think the UN is certainly one of the platforms where this convening can happen, and you can see this happening. For example, in the roadmap for digital cooperation, we took that as a major platform to broker this conversation around digital sustainability, right? So we are now developing this coalition for digital environmental sustainability and having all series of discussions around the sustainability aspects of digital tech, both the positive and the negative. So we're certainly using our convening power to bring stakeholders together and to have these conversations. And there's other platforms doing the same thing. Now, the question is, how do you translate or transform those discussions into real actions? Yeah. And this is where, in the Codes Initiative, we've identified 9 areas where we need multi-stakeholder collective action. And we're now trying to identify, who can lead and who can support these 9 impact areas. But I think ultimately it's a question of adding value to the stakeholders who are struggling with these issues, right? Like, we have to understand, what are the private sector actors? What are the public sector actors? What are the problems they're facing, and how do we broker dialogue between the two? And what we often see is private sector actors are not always talking between them. Yeah. In terms of their strategy. Public sector actors are not always talking amongst themselves, and then neither are talking with each other. So we actually play a very important brokering role there. Now, you talk about what can happen going forward. What are the big levers? Now, the Secretary General is brokering this Summit for the Future and this Global Digital Compact. And I think that is really where we need to be focusing our attention, making sure that the Summit for the Future has governance and sustainability squarely on the agenda, and that those two issues are taken forward in this Global Digital Compact. And that Digital Compact is a very important idea. It's meant to be a negotiated document between member states, but also with private sector endorsement. So I think, if we're going to solve these issues on a global level and start to look at some of these big governance questions and sustainability questions, that's the right place. That's the right place to have these conversations and to come up with this framework.
Love that. Now, you made for me a link in my mind. I started to think about the SDGs. Now, they're going to be up and running until 2030. And we also see that we have, you could say, a situation where we're in the decade of execution. And I see digital being a key element of the solution to reach those SDGs. Couple of elements, questions for you, maybe open doors, but do you expect the digital to have a prominent role in the successes of the SDGs?
Absolutely. I think they will not be achieved at the speed and scale needed without digital. I think that's very clear. I think one of the interesting things about the SDGs when it comes to environmental targets is that we only have data to monitor just over half of those targets. So there are still some big data gaps that we have to solve and plug in terms of simply monitoring where we stand on the different SDGs.
Yeah.
But that's more of a technical question. We can, if we invest the resources, we can actually collect that data to do the monitoring. And then it comes to the action, right? And I fully agree that there's just no way we're going to achieve that kind of systemic level change without digital technologies, which is exactly why that governance question is just so important. And that goes hand in hand with the equity question and the benefits question, right? Who's going to benefit? How are those benefits distributed? How do we govern it? How can we ensure that all stakeholders have a voice in that process? And that's the biggest challenge. And when I look at our processes, in the codes framework, we engaged about 1,000 individuals and experts in the action plan for a sustainable planet in the digital age. And that is, that's a big number, but it's really just a drop in the bucket on the number of people that should be engaged, right? We should be engaging millions of people in these processes. So I think we still lack the digital tools to do that kind of global scale engagement, like that bottom-up engagement at the millions level is what we should be trying to achieve, but we're still stuck in a very smaller group of stakeholders who have the capacity to engage and the expertise to engage. So
that's also my observation as well, that you could say there is a group of people talking on an international global level, but to some extent that's a very big, huge, I'd say, glass silo, because it doesn't somehow trickle down to on a local or national level. I've noticed, surprisingly, I mean, I wear this pin since my first time I came to the ITU for the AI for Good Summit. And in the beginning, when I started to wear that pin, people did not recognize this as you could say, the SDG symbol. I had completely different questions what this would represent. So how can we get people, say, you could say, on grassroots level to take that on board? Is this something you feel the UN or UNEP can do directly, or should we be dependent on local actors to you could say get grassroots involved?
I think we can do it directly. I think it's exactly where technologies can enable that kind of broad scale engagement. I think that the main challenge right now, actually, to be very frank, is processing that scale of input, right? Like when we're doing a big action plan and we're trying to identify the different priorities around the countries, if you're talking about input from millions of stakeholders, it becomes very difficult to process. Now, AI can certainly be a tool to help us process, but I just think we haven't yet worked out those two elements. How do we engage that scale of people? And then how do we process the input and make sense of it?
Yeah.
But I do think on both sides, tech can be a solution. We're just a little bit slow in understanding, how best to harness that technology. But I absolutely believe that we can be a conduit for that kind of engagement. And as I said, we've tried it, and it has been successful. It's been very gratifying to sort of reach out to, hundreds of countries and get that input. But the time it takes to process it is a lot, right? It's a slow process. And so we need to accelerate exactly that.
Yeah, because that you're touching on something why member states reached out to UNESCO around 2016. So, well, it's such a slow process to create systems for governance to have that accountability. And again, the digital technology moving so fast that we really need to rethink the instrument we're going to put in place to govern technology. I was just thinking, is UNEP considering the same thing? So are you using modern solution which can keep up with that change of speed?
Well, we'd like to be able to use technology to keep up with that pace of speed. I think the problem is that governance is an analog process, right? International governance requires relationship building, trust building between what is it, 97 countries or 96 countries. And that just takes time, right? So governing at that scale is slow, and it's a human to human process that in many cases can't be short-tracked or sped up through digital technologies. So we're a bit hamstrung by the very nature of the political process we're in. Now, having said that, we'd like to look at all the opportunities to accelerate it that are possible within that context. We've built a platform, for example, called InfoMIA, which is an attempt to sort of bring together all of the information around the implementation of different multilateral environmental agreements. So we're trying to aggregate, all best practice, all the laws, all the policies in one place to enable governments to share good practice and to access good practice. So we are using digital tools in some capacities when it comes to sharing information. But I think that question of how do you agree between member states to govern in a collective way at a global scale, it still remains elusive when it comes to using tech to do that. I mean, we can use tech to broker those conversations, but there's a process that the human-to-human trust-building process takes time. And, we're subjected to that. So I think as much as we aspire to use the tools and tech, we are still slowed down, I think, by that very process.
Okay, given that observation, are you optimistic we will fix it?
That's a very good question. I'm always optimistic. I'm about 60% optimistic and 40% pessimistic, right? I do think, a lot of this is also about building relationships, not just between governments, but also with the very technology companies that are driving the change. I think there needs to be much more dialogue between the public and private in how we govern the space. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic because I actually feel that the companies themselves are going to want governance frameworks. You can see many companies asking for governance frameworks on climate, for example. I think the same is going to happen in the digital space. There's going to be, at some point, there's just going to be too many standards, too many different ways of looking at things, and companies will want to see rationalization and some kind of harmonization. In fact, we're already seeing that. There's a company that I was chatting to last week around regulation when it comes to digital sustainability across their supply chains. And they're saying that 60 countries are now adopting regulations on digital sustainability that affect their supply chains. And the whole question of compliance is really becoming difficult.
Okay. The cynic in me would then ask, to what extent is this greenwashing? I mean, we see an interest in ESGs, and if companies start to promote, look how compliant I am according to these standards, that's going to make me more attractive. Do you feel? Do you recognize that? Is that too cynical, or is it that people truly believe, hey, this is going to make a difference?
I think that's a bit cynical in the sense that, it's good that we see digital sustainability regulations going around the world now. And I think it's great that countries are now adopting different regulations. The problem is they're very different in every jurisdiction. Yeah. And as a company, as a global company, if you're trying to build a product and sell it in these different jurisdictions and they're having conflicting regulatory regimes, that's just the basic problem, right? They might want to have sustainable supply chains, but in many cases, at the end of the supply chain, they don't simply have the information about their suppliers. So I'm suggesting that regulatory incoherence or regulatory conflict is probably not a good thing, and that it does warrant some attention. Harmonization at a global level, I think, is important. So I wouldn't call that greenwashing. I would say that they're trying to comply, and different member states are making it difficult to do so in an easy way. And I think harmonization and some form of coordinated regulation is needed.
Okay, fair point. Now, David, I want to end with a TED Talk I saw from you presenting some years back, which was fascinating to watch because I wasn't fully aware of that case. I don't know if you remember your own TED Talk. You talked about nature and peace. It was a great TED Talk in Geneva, where you showed what the disruption of nature meant for peacekeeping, or you could say avoiding peacekeeping initiatives. Now, I was wondering if you could take us along a little bit what that's about, and ask you, can you make a connection or a translation how you can apply this into what digital is able to do?
I think the argument is very clear. In many post-conflict places, there's a lack of trust between people, right? During a conflict, trust in institutions and trust in each other is often shattered, right? And you have to rebuild these places from the ground up, between communities as well as between communities and the government, depending on the conflict. But there's a very big trust deficit. And we see that environment can be one of those pathways for rebuilding trust, because there's a mutual interdependence on natural resources between communities, and also between communities and their governments. Governments want to, manage those resources in the best way possible. And so there needs to be some kind of dialogue between those levels and how you do that. So we see environmental resources, natural resources, as a pathway to rebuild trust. And obviously to rebuild livelihoods, right? In most of these post-conflict countries, natural resources are the basis for livelihood recovery and livelihood renewal. And so how do we use those natural resources in the best way possible, in the most sustainable way possible? And for issues like non-renewable natural resources, such minerals and mines and oil and gas and whatnot, how can those revenues be then used to sustain and to help, let's say, further develop renewable resources? So I think there's a whole series of potential benefits of integrating environmental and natural resources within this whole sphere of peace building. And we see a lot of very positive success in so doing. I mean, if you go into the communities and ask, what are your priorities? Usually at the 1, 2, or 3rd level, natural resources of some kind, governing natural resources is there. So now you want me to make the bridge to tech. I mean, that can really help us understand where the damage is much more easily. So satellite imagery and AI can really help us detect where is damage to the environment, what are the risks to the community from the release of chemicals, but also they can bring transparency in terms of sort of between communities or between countries, like who's using which natural resources, are they sticking to their agreements, and are the benefits being shared in the way that was agreed. So I think I look at technology as a major tool for transparency, and that transparency is a way of demonstrating compliance with the agreements and continuing that sort of trust building process.
Great. So, and do you also see digital directly playing a role in providing that trust?
Well, I see digital playing a role in terms of information sharing between communities. So it's a conduit for information. It's a conduit for assessing. I think more and more, you start to hear about digital contracts and blockchain-based contracts that could kind of be that intermediary. I haven't seen that in post-conflict yet, but I know it's coming. But yeah, I see more and more communities being interested in adopting digital tools. I mean, the proliferation of mobile phones has just been incredible, as I'm sure everybody who's been to these places over the last 20 years have seen. And so the question is really, how do we use those phones and that kind of appropriate technology to underpin that trust building and that confidence building process when it comes to natural resources?
Okay. Hey, one last question, Dave. It was fascinating talking to you and your work with the UNEP. In your work, how could an organization like the Institute for Accountability support your work?
I would say, so inside UNEP, we have sort of 2 big pillars. We've got UNEP's core work, and we work on 3 major areas. We work on environmental data and analytics, we work on private sector partnerships, and we work on national capacity building. So that's kind of our core area, but we're also the co-champion of this coalition for digital environmental sustainability. And that's where I would say you should plug in. Join the Codes Network, join the community of practice, and begin to engage in these different dialogue tracks around digital sustainability. In particular, the track on governance or the track on data and assessments. I think that's probably where you plug in best, and then see within that community how you can engage, how you can support, what the value you can take and what the value you can add could be.
Okay, great advice. And this is also a call out to all the listeners out there, members of the Institute. Just we'll make certain that the link is going to be available when in this video. So have a look at that. Reach out. And David, again, thank you so much for sharing what your insights, what you're doing, and how digital can help, and the role of accountability.
Thanks very much, Fritz. So it's a pleasure speaking to you, and I hope to see you in Geneva in a couple months.
Will do.
Cheers.